Thanks, especially because I'm not an expert on Marx. I'm also not really an expert on the Pittsburgh school either, which might become obvious. I've always been interested in Marx, partly because I come from Derby, which is sort of industrial town in the Midlands, for those of you who don't know it, so where Joseph Wright of Derby came from, so it's often said to be one of the birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution. But thus far, I suppose my interest there has been kind of amateur one, and a lot of my work has been in analytic philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, where Marx doesn't come up too often. But lately I've been working on a particular approach to the mind that it's struck me more and more has some parallels with themes in historical materialism, and should I accept that? And I've been reassured that now and again after talks over the last few years, sometimes somebody in the audience has come down to me and said, oh, this sounds a little bit similar to this or that Marxist thinker and so on. So I hope it's not just me. So I think what I'm going to do is just to try to sort of present a particular approach to the mind that I've tried to develop, to pick out what I think are some parallels between this approach and historical materialism, and to focus in particular on one British Marxist thinker, Christopher Caldwell. Some of you may know is a literary theorist and philosopher who died in the Spanish Civil War, but left some just wonderful unpublished works, and some that appeared just after his death. So I'll try and give you an overview, try and convince you that this is a kind of materialist historical view of the mind, and then draw on Caldwell to sort of say where I think the view might have to be filled out or might have to go next. Okay, so I'll click on this then. So the kind of background here is a theme. I originally trained in history and philosophy of science, and it's always struck me that there's a particular theme in a lot of work in the history and sociology of science, which is a very general theme, just that, you know, to exaggerate a little bit, the history of science is, roughly speaking, the history of new tools and new social contexts to use them. Right? That's an import right from, you know, mathematical diagrams in ancient Greece to computer simulations and so on. And that's a very well-known theme within lots of work in the history and sociology of science over the last 30 years or so. But there's a kind of persistent worry that perhaps particularly afflicts philosophers when we look at this, or at least some of my former self, my colleagues, where you sort of have this thought, yeah, you know, I know it's important that they had these institutions and they had these diagram systems and calculus and so on, but we're really interested in their thinking or reasoning, and that happens in here. So in other words, Cartesianism in some form or other, either in you know, a dualist form, or, as I'll say, a form that comes up within lots of work in cognitive science as well. So there's a persistent thought that while this history of science can be very interesting, what does it really tell us about reasoning, thinking, and the sorts of things that epistemologists often worry about, concepts, reasoning, knowledge, understanding, and so on. So that's why I ended up moving from philosophy of science to philosophy of mind, basically thinking that I needed to sort of reconcile with this this particular view of the mind, and I wrote a book on this that came out recently, trying to target what many people here will be familiar with, a Cartesian view, which, and by Cartesian I mean something like this, that it takes thoughts to be inner representations. And there are all sorts of different varieties of that view, dualist, materialist, all sorts of different forms you can give to those inner representations, of course, picture-like, language-like, and so on. And I tried to push in the book an alternative view which says something like this. Look, talk about an inner world is part and parcel of our ordinary concept of mind, folk psychology, as it's often put, but it's metaphorical, right? And so you shouldn't take it too seriously, right? So that there is this notion that Cartesianism, as it were, is somehow part and parcel of our ordinary concept of mind, but it's something that we don't take too seriously, and we shouldn't. Right? And a lot of the problems that we get into are, roughly speaking, problems when you take a metaphor and push it too far. Okay, so thoughts on this view come out as something like useful fiction. So I want to try to just introduce that view by beginning with Sellars' famous myth of Jones. Apologies to the Sellars scholars in the audience. I'm going to be just using that as a bit of a jumping off point, like people in analytic philosophy of mind often do, to introduce the view, then to try and pick out what I think are some parallels with themes in historical materialism, and then particularly in the last section to talk about a slightly different theme as mind, the notion of mind as an inner world, as a kind of ideological notion. And that's where I'm going to draw on Caldwell. Okay, so here's Sellars' myth of Jones, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Sellars says this, well, how could we come up with a concept of mind? Right? How could a society, and he calls it a Rileyan society, a mythical society that has a language referring to, say, overt bodily movements, but not a psychology, not a mental language, how could they acquire it? So this is a society that can say things like Adam's hand went up, but not Adam wanted to ask a question, Adam needed the toilet, or whatever, right? So how could they get it? Well, in Sellars' story, of course, there's a visionary theorist who he calls Jones, and Jones comes up with a visionary theory of the inner world, and his model for this theory is kind of a source of analogy for this theory is overt verbal behaviour, which the Rileyans engage in. And Jones says, well, you know, you can explain and predict what people are doing if you think that they have things in their heads which, like overt speech, have content and causal powers, but they're not uttered by any inner tongue, you know, but there are inner states with content and causal powers. Now I know, apologies to Sellars scholars, I know there's a lot to say about how exactly you interpret that, but at least for people in my neck of the woods, that's often a way of jumping off to this view that really what a concept of mind is a kind of proto-scientific theory. So thoughts on this view are something like atoms or theoretical entities. We infer the existence of atoms on the basis of observable things, like the results of certain experiments. Similarly, the way that this myth is often taken is saying we infer the existence of thoughts on the basis of behaviour. Okay. And one way of picking out this fictionalist idea that I want to push is start with the same myth, right, with this Rileyan society, but then think that what Jones introduces is not a theory of an inner world, but a useful metaphor. He says, look, it's really helpful to treat people as if they had things in their heads that were a little bit like sentences and pictures and so on. But don't take it too seriously. Right? It's just a kind of convenient way of describing people. It's a convenient fiction, but they don't really have these things. Right? So Sellars, and this view is not Sellars' character of Jones here is not a visionary theorist, it's just a kind of linguistic innovator, right? So talking about Italy as if it was a boot is really helpful for trying to describe where somewhere is in Italy. Similarly, but we don't think it's a giant boot in the Mediterranean, similarly talking about people as if they had little sentences and pictures in their heads is very useful for describing the way they get about the world, but we shouldn't think that they have them. Okay, so this is a bit like all sorts of other metaphors, like talking about people, you say, well, you know, Ruth's standing at a real crossroads right now. And you don't mean that she's literally standing at a road junction, you mean she's got to choose, say, whether to take the job or not. Right? But by talking about her life as if it was a journey, and stages in her life as if it were a journey, you manage to say something about her life, which is roughly she faces a difficult decision. The idea here is the same. By talking about people as if they had contentful inner states that cause them to do things, we manage to say useful things about how they behave. Right? And I'll come back to that idea. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the view. The thought is, in metaphor, people often talk about a primary and secondary domain. Right? So the primary domain is the one you're trying to talk about, the geography of Italy. The secondary domain is the domain you're using to make sense of the primary one, right? Boots, for instance. Right? And here the thought is the primary domain, what we're really interested in doing with folk psychology is making sense of people's behaviour, right? What they say and do. But we make sense of it by drawing on another domain, which is roughly speaking culture, right? Which is all the sorts of norm-governed social practices that people engage in, especially spoken and written language, right? But also pictures and diagrams and so on. And that's roughly what the concept of mind is. It's a metaphorical projection of the outer world of human culture onto the imagined inner world of the mind. Okay. At least that's what our folk psychology is. Sorry. So now, in Sellars' myth, of course, the model, as I mentioned, is overt speech. It's just someone says, I want a drink of water, and they pick up the bottle and have a drink of water. Right? Interactive philosophy there. I want to say, well, no, there are all sorts of other sources for metaphors we have to talk about the mind, and that, of course, is just because human culture is much richer, right? So you say a sentence out loud, and it's lost in the wind in the next moment. But of course, we've also developed all sorts of systems for writing information down and then looking it up again and acting on it when we need it. And metaphors of, say, memory as a kind of inner record go back at least 2,000 years and probably quite a lot more. Okay, so there are all sorts of ways in which we've developed norm-governed practices for using, say, bits of paper, right? Some examples here, memory, you know, we talk about memory as a kind of inner record. You call the list that you've made on Amazon for what you want for your birthday, your wish list, perhaps. We talk about, you know, things written down like itineraries as plans and so on. And of course, sometimes, you know, if you're anything like me, when you're making a decision, you talk as if you had a little committee going in on your head, say, oh, should I go out and get a sandwich? No, I probably ought to finish this paragraph first and have a little argument with myself, and then I decide what to do. Right? So we model things like decision-making on the model of two people having a discussion and then resolving what they're going to do, for instance. Reasoning is very often treated as if it had a kind of inner blackboard where you move through certain steps and so on. And as I said, the idea is that the claim is, look, it looks like the Cartesian's right. It looks like when we make claims about people's beliefs and desires, we're making claims about contentful inner states. That's the kind of standard position for lots of philosophy of mind. That's just what mental states are, right, is contentful inner states that have causal powers. Okay? But I want to say it's a bit like, the analogy should go a bit like if you say Ruth standing at the crossroads, right? You're saying something, but you're not asserting it, you're pretending. Right? You're pretending that she's standing at a crossroads. And in the context of this particular pretense, what you're really doing is make an assertion about the decision that she faces, right? Because you're mapping events in someone's life onto a journey. Similarly, I want to say, if you say, Adam believes that the number 73 goes to Oxford Street, right, back from my time living here and getting that bus a lot when it was a route master, and I had a little book of tickets, I'm not claiming that there is a sentence in my head that has that content that causes me to behave in a certain way. I'm just saying you won't go too far wrong if you treat me as if I had a notebook that said number 73 goes to Oxford Street. And when I was in my early days of living in London, I did carry around a little notebook and an A to Z to find my way around. That's how old I am, right? Didn't have a phone that told me that, and I just looked it up, right? Well, you can treat me when I don't have the notebook, right, in roughly the same way as you can treat me when I do. And that's what standing states are, roughly speaking. Okay. So there's a lot to say, I realise, to defend that view of the mind. Any devastating objections are all covered in the book, which is available at a not reasonable price from a publisher. So there's a lot to be said, I realise, to defend that view. What I wanted to do is just to pick out themes in this, or sort of implications that I think run in a similar sort of direction. So I'm fairly sure this view ends up as a kind of materialism. I'm pretty sure it makes the mind social and it makes it historical. So it's historical materialist. Whether it's historical materialist, I'm not quite sure about yet, but I want to try and draw on Caudwell to suggest that you could push it in that direction. So, as I said, I don't know how well Christopher Caudwell is known. I know people I know in sort of literary studies, his book Illusion in Reality is fairly well known. He died at 29 in the Spanish Civil War. It's best not to dwell on how much he managed to do in those years, because I think Helena Sheehan, whose book here, Marxism and Philosophy of Science, is what introduced me to Caudwell. I think he only really discovered Marxism in 1934, and he managed to write all of these books, many of which remain unpublished before his death, which is you know, something to think about. And they're full of wonderful ideas, even though some of them are unfinished. And I want to focus particularly on some ideas from his book called The Crisis in Physics, and it also appears in other essays like this wonderfully titled book, Studies in a Dying Culture. Right? So, okay, so I'll get back to Caudwell in a moment. So here's the way in which this view is material, and I think it's a way that's not the standard way of being a materialist nowadays, at least, as I say, in my neck of the woods in philosophy of mind. And of course, what's the basic commitment of Cartesianism, as I'm using the view? It's that the mind is an inner world. And once upon a time, that inner world was something immaterial. But of course, nowadays, people, hard-nosed materialists that many people are, they'll identify it with the brain. Right? or they'll say it's the if they're a functionalist, they'll say it's some kind of computational structure realized by the brain or what have you. But the key point is that the structure of the Cartesian view is very often retained. So we often move from saying that the mind is an inner spirit or some sort of mind stuff to saying that it's the brain, and it becomes literally inner in that sense. But the structure, that the mind is something inner, something private, something often inferred from behaviour in the case of other people, is very often retained in this view. Right? So on the one hand, we've got lots of varieties of Cartesianism, approaches that take the mind to be an inner world. On the other hand, of course, you've got lots of views that you could lump under the heading of behaviourism, which say that inner world is somehow dubious for some reason or other, methodologically, or because of its privacy or what have you, and so they try to get rid of it, right? So in the classic form, translate talk about the inner mind as inner world into talk about behaviour, and that seems to fail too. And the position I want to set out is a kind of middle position, right? So in the late 90s, we might have talked about this as the third way, but that's probably not great in a conference on Marxism to start bringing Blairism up and so on. So the thought is this, right? The Cartesians, their mistake is to take the metaphor too literally, right? They hear us talking about the mind as if it were an inner world, and they think that there must be some spiritual or non-spiritual substance that is the mind, right? The behaviourist mistake is to not take it seriously enough, right? In other words, to think, or to put it another way, to overlook the fact that metaphors add something to our language, which is, one of the things they add is they allow you to say things that you can't say in literal speech, right? So they expand your domains of expression, and that's why classic forms of behaviorism fail, because you can't translate away these metaphors into claims about behaviour, right? So the kind of middle road is to say, look, Cartesianism is not a kind of imposition on our ordinary language. It is there as part and parcel of it, but it's something that, in fact, when you push the folk on it, you say things like, okay, where's your belief that London is capital of the UK? Is it on the left or right? They start to balk and think, oh, okay, that's not. And I want to say that's like the question, that guy's got a chip on his shoulder. Oh, really? Right or left? Right? That's a silly question. And it's a silly question not because the mind is a spooky non-physical substance. It's a silly question because you were speaking metaphorically. Right? And that's one of the features of metaphors, is that you push them too literally. They don't make sense. Okay, so the point I wanted to highlight here is that this is a materialist view in that it denies that there is any non-material substance that realizes the mind, but it's not a mechanistic view. Right? So I think the view that mind is in a mechanism that in some form or another is the dominant view within lots of cognitive science is, in a way, is equally mistaken, right? Because it still starts from the Cartesian starting point. So it's interesting here if you think of both Gilbert Ryle and Marx use ghostly kind of language to talk about this. So Ryle, of course, is the person who came up with this lovely term, the dogma of the ghost in the machine, to talk about Cartesianism. And of course, we think of Marx and the commodity fetish, right, as a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic forms of relation between things. Well, the thought is that's roughly what's happening with Cartesianism. What really makes your claims about someone else's mind true or false is the long, drawn-out pattern of their social behaviour. But what happens when you talk about that as if it were an inner world, right? You take that pattern, say, of their complicated engagement with the number 73 bus over a long period, like talking to people about it, and you, as it were, compress it and talk about it as if it were something in here that were mechanically guiding their behaviour. And the thought there is there's a kind of reification here, which is similar to some of the things that people say about the commodity fetish, right? You're taking something that in fact is a long drawn out social interaction, and you're talking about it as if it was something object-like within the individual person, okay? And I'm going to come back to this idea when I talk about Caldwell, okay? So one feature of this view is it's materialist, but not mechanist, right? It's not materialist in the way that lots of standard views are in philosophy of mind. Another thing that I just wanted to draw out in case it weren't obvious, and I know in a conference where there's lots of people who are interested in the Pittsburgh school, this might be just very obvious, but I wanted to draw it out. That on this view, the mind is fundamentally social, right? And the reason for that is as follows, that Sellars' myth, of course, begins with these Rylean ancestors, right? These people who don't have the concept of mind, but they do have a language, say, for talking about overt behaviour. And it's part and parcel of Sellars' myth that these Rileyan ancestors have language, right? They can already question things and assert things and so on, but they don't have the concept of mind, right? So the thought is that's the moment where the fictionalist story comes in. The story comes in when it's saying, well, how could a community that already has language, already says things to each other, questions and asserts, how could they come up with this idea of the mind as an inner world? Well, the thought is they do it by metaphorical projection. Right? And that's why our concept of mind has the structure it does. But of course, the real challenge for this view, like a lot of views in this vicinity, is, well, go back to the pre-Rileyans and ask yourself, how could a community like that have acquired language in the first place? And of course, for many people who are committed to Cartesianism, this story just won't get off the ground because they think of, roughly speaking, language as expressing prior contentful states. Right? So in other words, it's the intention, the classic view, of course, the dominant view within much of philosophy of mind and cognitive science is that intentionality begins with mental representations and extends outwards. And all I really want to draw out is that this fictionalist view, like, of course, a lot of people in the Pittsburgh school, thinks it goes the other way around. So the story has got to be something like what John Haugeland sketches out, saying, well, how could these pre-Rileyans have got to the Rileyan position? How could they have acquired language? Well, because they're norm-governed social creatures, right? They're conformist, as Haugeland puts it, right? They act alike and they punish others if they don't, and then within that community, norms arise, and tools are used within those norms that have prescribed uses, and roughly speaking, that's what language is. Now, I don't need to tell this audience there's an awful lot more that you should say there, but my point simply is that for many people, as I find giving talks on this, for many people they think that a view like this just can't get off the ground. It ends up just collapsing because you need mental representations in order to ground intentionality. And all I'm doing here is just gesturing to an alternative story that's been filled out a lot more by others, but showing that a consequence of that story is that the social comes first. Right? So just to, if we think of the famous phrase in Anfang war die Tat, right? So the view is here, how does the mind come into being? Well, first there's the deed. People behave in certain ways. They're pre-Rileyans. Then, because they're norm-governed creatures and they utter things and they write things down, then comes the word, right? And then the whole concept of mind is a metaphorical mapping of words back onto deeds. It's taking all the representational structure of culture and talking as if people had that internally, right? In order to make sense of their deeds. And of course, their deeds in this culture become enormously richer than they could have been without it. And that's one thing that I'll come back to. So of course, objecting, I've just read Robinson Crusoe again with my children and remembered how there's lots of violence in Robinson Crusoe that you forget. That, of course, there's a parallel here between the view of the mind that you get from Cartesianism. So Ryle says, according to the Cartesian, each of us lives the life of a ghostly Robinson Crusoe. In other words, our minds are trapped up inside us. We know our own mind better than we could know anything, but other people are largely mysterious and found by shaky inferences and so on. And that, for Caudwell, too, is what he calls the central bourgeois error. Okay. The last feature I just wanted to bring out is that this, if you adopt this view, and again, this will be familiar to many people here, you will think that the mind itself has a history. And that's an idea that, as I say, will be familiar to many people in this audience, but isn't in lots of other cases. Why does the mind have a history on this view? Well, because as you get new tools and new social practices, you get new forms of behaviour. Many of those forms of behaviour, like written record keeping, get mapped back onto our concept of mind for time. And then, and this is a theme for those of you who know the extended mind thesis debate, what happens is very often we can only get into certain mental states by interacting with tools. There are things you can only know or understand by interacting, say, with pen or paper. Right? So we as it were, the limits of mind on this view are constantly expanding with new bits of material culture. And I won't go into that too much. I've discovered that there's something like 400,000 species of beetles that we've discovered now. It seems to me for many of even experts, having a concept of some of those beetles such that you satisfy the possession conditions required, like you could distinguish it from other beetles, you probably need a database and you won't be able to do it with your bare brain. Okay, so just to come to the last section, because I'm aware of time, The part I wanted to just to finish with is a part that this is where I've got thinking a lot more about Marx and Caudwell in particular, is to ask this what seems like a really obvious question is, if Cartesianism is false, why is it so attractive? Right. So Ryle says these things like, you know, you teach first years and the Humean view of the mind to a first year undergraduate just seems kind of obvious, right? I mean, it certainly did to me anyway. I just thought, yeah, of course, ideas are little pictures and you act on them and so on. And then Ryle says, yeah, but any second year undergraduate can show that's obviously nonsense, right? So if you take that view, you've got this picture where the mind really is something, roughly speaking, material. It's about practices in time. It's social. It's an essential. You can't have a mind without being a social creature on this view. And it's historical. It changes. But according to Cartesianism, it's an inner mechanism, either spooky or not. It's individual. It's radically private. And it's ahistorical. Right? It's, roughly speaking, fixed in the absenting evolutionary history. Right? And now, so why is it so attractive? Well, one answer that I've focused on giving so far is a cognitive one. I want to say Cartesianism, even though false, is a useful fiction. In other words, it does cognitive work for us, even though it's false. And I think that's, as someone who's worked a lot on models in science, an awful lot of the explanations we give of the world are false, and we know they're false, but they're just the best we can do, because the world's a messy place. Right? So reification, abstraction, and something is just a familiar way, of course, of trying to engage with the world. And Engels says something very, very similar. But I think a compatible answer is, as well as being a useful fiction, it takes the form it does because of its ideological overtones. And this is the bit that I want to get from Caudwell. So aware of time, so I won't go too much into this. Here's, though, how this is often thought about. So here's what Ryle says when he says, well, how did we get into the mess? He says, Descartes found himself in two conflicting motives. As a man of scientific genius, he could not but endorse the claims of mechanics. Yet as a religious and moral man, he could not accept the discouraging rider to those claims, namely that human nature differs only in degree of complexity from clockwork. Right? So here it's a kind of, for Ryle, it's basically a mistake. And it's a mistake that the intellectual hierarchy make, but the ordinary folk don't. Right? So roughly, it's a category mistake. The ordinary folk are not Cartesian, but along come philosophers, and they misread ordinary language and impose Cartesianism. And I won't go into those quotes too much. As I said, the basic idea of the fictionalist view is that's not right. That it's not just a myth misreading ordinary language, as Ryle would think. It's not just a philosopher's myth, but it's part and parcel of that language. But then the question is why, right? And as someone who is slightly skeptical about philosophers' claims to change the world, this seems slightly surprising. Right? Why should this Cartesian myth have become, if it's just a mistake, why should it become so prevalent? And when did it? Right? Some people seem to think it's kind of primitive or natural. And the view that I want to take from Caudwell is, well, here's a kind of explanation for why, when the Cartesian view becomes dominant and why it becomes dominant. The central theme in a lot of Caudwell's work is the subject-object dichotomy, and for him, dialectic seems to be about the subject-object dichotomy and the different forms it can take. So he says the relation between subject and object, ego and universe, is itself dialectic. And he offers a view of this, so the thought is roughly, well, in the ancient world, the dominant productive relation is master to slave, and so you get something like Aristotelian forms where nature itself is sort of commanded, right? You get teleology as the dominant mode of explanation. And then with feudalism, that's arranged into a kind of hierarchy where there's some sort of natural law that's governing all of these forms. Now, much of Caudwell's focus is on what he thinks comes with the bourgeois set of relations, and that's mechanism. But it's mechanism understood from the perspective of the bourgeois within the system of production. Right? So the thought is, look, the proletariat are actively engaging with nature. They know that the subject-object relation, in a sense, is a kind of push them back and forth, right, with the world. They have to sweat using the machines. But for the bourgeois, standing, as it were, at one remove, governing the factory, nature is machine as run by the people that they hire, right? So he talks about it being as if they're kind of behind a glass screen in an aquarium. So that the thought is, well, there's the particular nature that the subject-object dichotomy or the mind-matter relation takes. And the reason we get the mind-body problem within post-Descartes is reflects the division of labour within capitalist society. It reflects the point of view that the bourgeois takes within that. Desires are something that come, as it were, mysteriously from the market. So the desires as the mind are kind of free, but nature takes the form of a machine that you need to watch at one remove and determine the laws that govern it. So it's nature as overseen by the factory owner or what have you. Okay, so society is the struggle of man and nature. In its more refined ideology of society, this basic struggle appears as the basic problem of the subject-object relation. Man is the subject, nature is the object. Therefore, in bourgeois society, the object appears solely as things over which man has rights and whose laws or necessity he discovers in order to satisfy his desires. Right? These desires appear arbitrarily proposing an end for nature to satisfy. Okay, so you know. Oh, here's a couple more quotes. The famous dualism of mind and matter is something artificially imposed by the special categories of society that's generated philosophy. And I think he means, you know, arguably the whole structure of much of Western philosophy post-Descartes is the mind isn't in a world. Is there a world out there? Does the mind map onto it? And so on. And for Caudwell, that's a reflection of the division of labour. And mechanism, he says, is an illusion peculiar to the ruling class. The men who work the machine realise that so far from it's expressing a one-way relation of man to nature, it expresses an each-way relation of which they get the full brunt. But for the bourgeois, that's not the case. Okay, as I said, in contrast, desire appears spontaneous. So just to sum up, the thought here is that we're in a funny position here where for the Cartesian, and by that I mean the kind of standard position in lots of, you open a philosophy of mind textbook and it asks, does the mind exist? What it means is, well, it will often focus on beliefs and desires, and it will take them to be the question of, do contentful causal inner states exist with causal powers, okay? And for many people, that's just what the mind is, and it's ahistorical. For people like Ryle or later Wittgenstein, that's a misreading, it's a mistake, a misreading of ordinary language. But they have very little to say about how ordinary language changes over the time. The view seems to be ordinary language is kind of pure until the philosopher comes along and misreads it. And I want to say, no, there's an intermediate position here that says, by now anyway, Cartesianism is part and parcel of ordinary language, but it's used as a metaphor, and you can see that by trying to push it too far, and that's what a lot of conceptual analysis does, that people like Ryle and Wittgenstein do. And now what I'm interested in asking is, well, that's, as it were, a contemporary analysis saying this is what our concept of mind is now, and then we ask ourselves, well, how did we get in this position? And that's where I think this history comes in, where roughly speaking, the human behaviour augmented by tools is expanding over time. The limits of the mind are therefore expanding over time. And the ways in which we try to make sense of that behaviour with our metaphors are constantly shifting. And one idea is that the notion of mechanism in particular is a bit of bourgeois ideology. Okay.
So I just wonder why, well, I guess it might be a remark or it might be a question, but I wonder about the resources from German idealism, or possibly also dialectical materialism, right? So the view that, like, there's just an emergentism, right? And you like, the dialectical materialist thinks that the mind somehow emerges from, you know, transformation of quantitative changes over time that lead to a qualitative change, but there's no, like, spookiness going on. Or the German idealist view that, like, structures of summons or recognition are, like, integral to how we become agents. But at no point is there any sort of thought that the mind is, like, so that those kinds of views get you the view that the mind is historical, it's social, it's bodily even. But at no point is there sort of a tendency to think that it's just a mere metaphor or something. So I just wonder, like, why wouldn't you hold that kind of view from Hegel or dialectical materialism? Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. No, you're quite right. So here is where I've been gulled by lots of the analytic tradition, I think, into misexpressing things early on, which I hope I'm a bit more careful in. That, as I said, very often when you ask, well, does the mind exist in that tradition, you're assuming something like the Cartesian picture. In other words, you're assuming that asking whether beliefs exist is to ask whether internal states with content and a particular causal power exist. So I want to say, so a better way of putting the view would be to say, does the mind exist? Yes and no. If you mean an inner world, if you mean contentful inner states like that cause us to behave, no. If you mean something more similar to what you said, some kind of extended practice over time involving signs, yes. Now, where I think the fictionalist view that I tried to push adds a bit something to that idea is the question of, well, why do we talk about it in the way we do, right? Why is it that we've got this Cartesian view, even though the mind really is this extended practice? And the thought is that's where the metaphorical story comes in. It's because basically human practice is a blooming, buzzing confusion, and if you try to describe it without the resources of folk psychology, it's extraordinarily difficult. What's the structure of that? Well, the view I want to point out, it's taking some of those human practices and mapping them metaphorically onto others. So you can make sense of somebody even when they don't have a notebook to hand, as if they did have a notebook to hand. And that's roughly what the concept of mind is. Yeah.
Thank you. Very fascinating. While you were speaking, I was thinking about the difference between your fictionalism and illusionism, like Dennett's, for instance. And I thought I had this explanation. I mean, illusionism has to explain why you have such an illusion. So you have to give something like a debunking argument. But then at the end of the talk, you gave your explanation why you have. So I'm confused about that. And here is why I think this is relevant from a Sellarsian perspective, because Sellars uses behaviorism and also phenomenology from a methodological point of view. So he says, well, I do not endorse behaviorism, I do not endorse phenomenology, but I see that they give me something that I have to take into account when I explain. So I have to take into account verbal behavior, but I also have to take into account qualia, for instance, when you have when you give your theory of mind. So let's put it like this: when does a metaphor works? What has to take into account? So what are the data that you have to explain?
So thank you. There's a lot I could say about sort of conscious access, introspection in general. I think perhaps what I want to say is quite similar to Sellars. So I do think that we have sensations, but we make too quick a jump from sensation to thought, basically, and that it's that interpretive gap is where the fictionalist story comes in. And that's part of the error explanation. Part of it is that, we can say things to ourselves not out loud, and that leads us to think that thoughts are inner representations. So the question of, just to pick up on, so that there is something you have to say about sensation, and that's part of the explanation for why this view is compelling. When does a metaphor work? Yeah, good question. So here I want to say right, here's the quick answer. It works, roughly speaking, because people can behave without notebooks roughly in similar ways to the way they behave with them. Right? Now, but we shouldn't do what many people in cognitive science do, which is then infer from predictive success to truth, which is, of course, the standard way of realizing, say, well, all of our theoretical apparatus seems to refer to inner representations, therefore we have them. And roughly speaking, my explanation there is basically, I think the notion of inner representation is incoherent, and at least as we have it at the moment, and that you can offer an explanation for success that doesn't require truth. So, and part of that is very familiar. If you treat us in certain ways, we tend to try to keep our promises and behave. The more that you expect someone, so the classic examples are like, I expect someone to be at the airport, Fodor will say, at a particular time, and then lo and behold they are. Isn't folk psychology a wonderful explanation? And of course, if any of us have had an appointment to keep like that, we write things down all the time. We realise that we're supposed to be. And so I think, yeah, it works because there are patterns in our behaviour that are similar to our patterns in behaviour with tools. but the fact that it works to the extent that it does, it shouldn't allow us to infer truth. That's roughly the, yeah.
Thank you so much. I guess I want to ask, you made the metaphor to scientific, theoretically postulated entities at the beginning. And how is this different from an instrumentalism with regards to, and would you endorse that rather, I guess? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but it occurs to me to bring in the notion of analogy. And I wonder if you would make a distinction there, because you could say, if you're a Sellarsian, that analogically you are picturing things in themselves, and this seems to be something distinct from metaphor. I'd just be curious to hear you say something about that.
Yeah, I think that's helpful as a pair because they kind of pull in the opposite direction. So how does it differ from instrumentalism? I think there are lots of classic thought experiments that seem to show, Blockhead is one for those who know, right, which seem to show that that our ordinary notion of mind cares about more than outward behaviour, right? And that's so in other words, we have loads of thought experiments in the literature, right? Some of which seem to point in the direction of mind being something private and inner, and super Spartans, what have you. And then some that seem to pull exactly the opposite direction, like Dennett saying, imagine the newspaper telling you there were neuroscientists discovered there were no beliefs, you'd carry on the same way. So I want to say the reason that fictionalism is different to instrumentalism is it says you pick out these behaviours by the metaphor of something inner. And it's that kind of dual two-facing move that's very familiar from metaphor in general. And I want to say that's why we're so conflicted over these thought experiments, and that's why pure instrumentalism fails, right? Maybe if the metaphor was dead and it was just picking out the patterns, then we wouldn't be affected by those thought experiments. But the fact that we are shows that it's still alive, and that's the difference. And on the analogy point, yeah, I mean, terms like model, metaphor, and analogy are kind of course, are slippery, and I think there is something similar happening. I guess a lot of people who would want to use the term analogy would be more realist in their inclinations in general. Now, not always, right? So, and so there, one of the things I want to say is it's a metaphor that isn't literally true, right? So, the clouds can be happy today metaphorically, but not literally. That just lots of metaphors you use when you ask yourself, what could that literally mean, are just nonsense. And I want to say the idea of inner contentful states, basically, when it comes down to it, is nonsense. So in other words, it makes sense metaphorically, and it makes sense to talk about external things literally, but the crossing of them in metaphor is not. And that's why you could call it an analogy, but that crucial element that there are these inner contentful states that many people would want to take from that analogy, I think just fails. Yeah, and that's why I would be happier talking about fiction.